and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome Professor Mijeong Kwon, Assistant Professor of Management at the Denver Business School, University of Colorado, Denver. In this episode, Professor Mijeong will be sharing valuable insights from her research, Moral Burdens at Work, the Dilemma of Doing What You Love. For over 50 years, business research and education have highlighted the positive impact of intrinsic motivation. The idea of loving your work has become ubiquitous, appearing in everything from inspiring graduation speeches to the tweets of prominent CEOs. Dr. Mijeong Kwon's research dwells into whether this widespread valuation of intrinsic motivation might have an unintended dark side of employees' value judgments about themselves and others. In her work, Dr. Kwon argues that when intrinsic motivation is valued in employees' social context, it becomes associated with positive values and is moralized. Once moralized, intrinsic motivation transforms into a source of value judgments. Through field surveys and a mix of online and lab experiments, Dr. Mijeong explores how the moralization of intrinsic motivation can lead to potentially negative impacts on employees' perceptions and behaviors in the workplace. Her areas of expertise including motivation, morality, and ethics. She was awarded the 2021 LKS Fellow at the Lee Kong Chian School of Business, Singapore Management University. Professor Mijeong earned her PhD in Management and Organizations from the University of Michigan and her MSc in Management from Yosei University, Korea. Professor Mijeong Kwon, thank you for accepting our invitation. It is true delight to have you on this episode.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful opportunity, Deepak. I'm really excited today to share more about my recent publication on something that I call the moralization of intrinsic motivation.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, the concept of moralization of intrinsic motivation has become a focal point in your research. Can you explain what this term means and how it influences our view of work?
Yes, of course. So the moralization of intrinsic motivation is a process by which intrinsic motivation, loving your work, becomes something we elevate to a moral standard. So it is a notion that being passionate about your work is not just desirable, but also essential for you to be considered a good worker. And when you think about motivation, it is actually an internal cognition, right? Like you have some reason for working. However, when you moralize intrinsic motivation, it becomes a really important social standard you have not just for yourself, but also for others around you. And because of that, there is a potential where you might minimize other types of motivation, such as working for financial security or working for supporting the family. And there might be a risk where employees who work for more practical reasons, not just passion, might feel alienated in their workplace.
In your research, you mentioned that loving your job is often seen as a litmus test for being a good worker, especially in individualistic cultures. How does this cultural expectation shape how we view motivation at work?
In individualistic cultures, such as in the United States, self-expression is considered really important. And because of this, intrinsic motivation, loving your work, is often considered as the most authentic form of motivation that you can have. And because of this belief, there might be a perception that when somebody is not visibly demonstrate their passion, they might be considered less dedicated to their work. So imagine a coworker who always clocks out at 5 p.m. because the person has to pick up his daughter at 5 p.m. But that could be considered as less dedicated at work compared to another coworker who always stays late at work because of their love for working, even though their performance is the same.
What are some of the positive aspects of intrinsic motivation in the workplace, and how can it lead to more fulfilling careers for employees?
I really love this question because whenever I talk about the moralization of intrinsic motivation, I really want to emphasize intrinsic motivation is a positive thing. So when you love your work, it's good for you and it will lead to higher levels of engagement, performance, creativity. There are a lot of good things about being intrinsically motivated at work. So when you have intrinsic motivation, you will frequently experience this state of flow where you feel absorbed into your work, and that would enhance your job performance as well as your job satisfaction. So it is a good thing. And what I would like to emphasize is the negative consequences might come in when we overemphasize intrinsic motivation and we expect it from everybody in this world to be the sole reason for working.
Professor Mijeong, you also highlight some potential downsides to the overemphasis on intrinsic motivation. Could you elaborate on how this emphasis can impact job security and how it might lead to discrimination against certain workers?
Yes, I am really passionate about this question. So I have three issues surrounding the moralization of intrinsic motivation. So the first issue is intrinsic motivation is important and it enhances performance, but it is not the only type of motivation that enhances performance. So when you think about family motivation, you are working for your family, it can actually compensate the lack of intrinsic motivation in a way that if you really work for your family, but you do not really enjoy your work, you can still have the same high level of persistence and performance. And same thing for extrinsic motivations, striving for success. When you have both intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, that's the time where you can synergetically achieve a good performance in terms of both quantity and quality. So all these other types of motivation are important, but when we only overemphasize this intrinsic motivation, there is a risk that we might not acknowledge the importance of these other types of motivation. So that's one issue. The second issue is actually for people who have intrinsic motivation or moralize intrinsic motivation themselves. So when you have intrinsic motivation, people might expect you to take on additional tasks without enough compensation because intrinsic motivation is often considered the opposite of extrinsic motivation or money. So if you are an artist and you really love art, maybe your friends will ask you to, hey, just like paint this for free because you love your art. And if you truly love it, you shouldn't get any money out of it. And that doesn't really make sense. So that could lead to potential exploitation. And my final reason that I think the moralization of intrinsic motivation is not always good is we are not accurate in gauging others' motivation. So when you think that your colleague has high intrinsic motivation, like low intrinsic motivation, there is a chance that you are not accurate. So a personal example is coming from myself. I tend to smile a lot and I have this bubbly attitude. And people often think that I love my job just because I have this positive attitude naturally. But this is not universally shared. And I know a lot of my friends who are more like a quieter compared to myself, but they really deeply love their work. So we are really inaccurate, and I don't think it makes sense for us to make judgment of other people based on such inaccurate perception.
Professor, how do workers from collectivistic cultures or low socioeconomic backgrounds experience this moralization of intrinsic motivation differently from their counterparts in individualistic cultures?
So when you're coming from more collectivistic culture, you are more likely to prioritize the goal of your social groups over your own like self-focused goals. And this also applies to people coming from lower socioeconomic background. When you think about collectivism, there is a stereotype that it is about East Asian countries, it's a like a nation level, but we can also consider this at the individual level. So when you are coming from lower socioeconomic background, there is a higher chance that you have more collectivistic belief at the individual level because you do not really have enough resource to navigate all these life situations just by yourself. So you have to work with your social group. Now, when you have this priority for social groups, the moralization of intrinsic motivation becomes almost irrelevant for you because the goals of your social groups becomes more important than self-expression. So for example, one of the major reasons I decided to become a professor is to make my parents feel proud of me because I am really grateful for their support throughout my life. And this is a very collectivistic reason and not really related to intrinsic motivation. So the problem is when people coming from this collectivistic background or hold collectivistic beliefs encounter the moralization of intrinsic motivation, they might feel that they are undervalued in their workplace just because they do not have or demonstrate enough passion.
You shared a personal experience about the cultural shock you face when moving from South Korea to the United States and observing how passionate people were about their jobs. How do you think cultural differences in expressing motivation impact the way employees are perceived in global work environments?
I really think cultural differences could potentially lead to cultural misunderstanding in terms of how we view different reasons people work. So when I first came to the United States, I noticed that people display a lot of positive emotions in this country. So displaying negative emotions is considered as unprofessional in the United States. That's kind of same here and in my home country. But people say a lot of positive words like awesome, great, and they will also emphasize their positive emotions toward their work. Like, this is really fun. I really enjoy it. I'm super passionate. Whereas in my home country, people seldom display that type of positive emotion, even when they think that their work is fun. So if you are a manager working globally with other employees coming from multicultural background, there is a chance that you feel like, oh, like these people are not really engaged in work because they do not really demonstrate all these positive emotions, but that might not be true. So I would say you really would want to recognize the difference in terms of demonstrating emotions and different types of motivation in different cultural backgrounds.
You draw a fascinating parallel between moralizing intrinsic motivation and the moralization of practices like vegetarianism or veganism. How do these moralized behaviors change the way people perceive others? And how can this analogy apply to work culture?
So that's an interesting case, right? So moralization is essentially a preference turning into a value. So when you think about vegetarianism, there are some people who adopt vegetarianism because of the preference. So they taste like the taste of the veggies. And there are people who adopt the vegetarian diet because they think that it is healthy. However, there also are people who think that it is a moral thing to do. So you shouldn't kill other animals. And for these people, you will also frequently observe some of them have this clear boundary of really following a strict vegetarian diet versus, oh, you are not strict enough. So the same thing applies to the intrinsic motivation, the moralization of intrinsic motivation, where when you moralize intrinsic motivation, you draw a strict distinction between people who love the work in group and people who do not seemingly enjoy their work, which is out group. And that could lead to some sort of discrimination or feeling of exclusion in the workplace that might be problematic.
Professor Mijang, how can managers and business leaders avoid the pitfalls of moralizing intrinsic motivation in the workplace? And what are some of the ways to create a more inclusive and supportive work environment for employees with diverse motivations?
So I think managers should really value diverse types of motivation. And one thing they can do is just recognize different types of strength associated with different types of motivation. So again, there is a bursting energy and creativity coming from highly passionate or highly intrinsically motivated employees. However, there also is a consistent delivery of a lot of outcomes in terms of quantity coming from more externally oriented employees. So you would really want to acknowledge these strengths. And perhaps you can also set up clear rules when you do performance evaluations. So it is not based on some like inaccurate perception of somebody's motivation and rather based on more accurate, like clear rules that you establish for your employees.
You mentioned that many workers might leave a job prematurely if they don't feel passionate about it, thinking they are morally failing. What advice would you give to employees who feel this way, and how can they approach their careers in a more balanced way?
So if I can give a one advice, I would say you do not need to have your work as the only source of personal fulfillment in your life. And I really love this question because I frequently get questions from my own students agonizing, Professor Kwon, like, should I take this job because I really like it, but it doesn't really pay well? Or should I go to, say, like a consulting or financial investment because these are business undergraduates? Because those jobs pay well. And I tell my students, it is your choice and there is no right or wrong answer. Reflect on something that's important in your life and make the decision. And I also share my personal story. It's like really personal. But when I was young, I always wanted to become a novelist. I wanted to write novels for my life, but I didn't choose this career for multiple reasons. And in my age 20, I thought that's the end of my dream. Like I will never have a chance to take on this again in my life. And it turned out that life is much longer than I expected. And then I have a lot of time to pursue this, not just as a hobby. I go to workshops, I frequently interact and write with other writers. And there are multiple ways that I could almost pursue this as my second career. So if you are a young professional and find try to find a new job for yourself, or you're agonizing, should I continue work on this job? I would like to emphasize it is totally fine for people to work for multiple different reasons. And if passion is not one of them, it is still fine as long as it supports other important goals that you have in your life.
For those who might not enjoy their work but are still committed to it for practical reasons, what strategies can they use to feel more satisfied and engaged, even if their motivation isn't driven by passion?
Yes, this is a really good question. One of the negative consequences of the moralization of intrinsic motivation that I discuss for people who moralize intrinsic motivation themselves is they might prematurely leave their job when they feel like, I don't love my job enough. So there are some things that you can try in order to feel more personal fulfillment in your job, which is called job crafting. And there are three different types of job crafting. One is task crafting. And this is basically you are play around with your task boundaries. For example, I am a professor and my professor job involves teaching. And let's say I really love teaching. Then I can spend more time developing additional teaching materials or spend time with my students, even though it is not required. So that's task crafting. And the second is relational crafting. When you think about any work, we work for other people. So we almost always have some sort of beneficiaries of our work. So what you can do is you can build more connections with those people so that you can feel more fulfilled in your work. So for example, as coming from the same example, I'm a professor, so I could build like a deeper relationships with my students or even staff members around in order to feel like more fulfilled and what my job serves in their life. And the final type of job crafting is cognitive crafting. This might sound cushy for some people, but it's a really, really powerful tool. You can simply change the way you think about or you define your job. One of the examples is, let's say your job is to clean the street. And you can say, my job is to clean the street. Or you can say, my job is to make everybody who walks this street feel happier. And that's true because when I walk down the street in front of the place that I live and I see this very clean street with people cleaning it, I am really grateful. So when you change the cognition around how you think about your job, that could lead to much greater personal fulfillment. So you can try these tactics. And after trying all these tactics, if you still don't really feel passionate about your job, as I said before, it is perfectly fine. There is like no right or wrong reason for working.
Professor Mijang, in your research, you emphasize the importance of recognizing different motivations in employees. How can managers avoid biases when assessing motivation and performance? And what changes can they make in hiring practices to focus on contributions rather than personal reasons for working?
Yes, so the first thing I always recommend is to have a clear role for performance review, as I previously mentioned, instead, so that you can minimize your inference coming from some inaccurate information, not just intrinsic motivation, but something that could subjectively affect those criteria. And of course, in terms of hiring, you can avoid the question like, why do you work? Like, why do you want to work in this company? And make this question more specific, like, how can you contribute to our organization? And that could be something that you can do in terms of hiring.
You suggest replacing the common interview question, why do you want to work here, with what do you hope to contribute as an employee? How would this shift in focus improve the interview process and workplace dynamics?
So when you ask a question, why do you work or why do you want to work here? I sometimes think with this strong emphasis, a societal emphasis on the moralization of intrinsic motivation, that question almost sounds like a trap question, right? Like you don't expect anybody to say, I am working just because of the paycheck. Like nobody will say that. So I would rather say you make this question to be specific. How can you contribute to this organization if you join? And you will be surprised by the diverse reasons people have and diverse ideas people have about this contribution. So, for example, they would say, I'm a really conscientious employee, so I meet all the deadlines, and I know like time is really important thing in this type of job. So that's how I can contribute. Or other employees would say, I am really strong in terms of teamwork, so I can contribute to a strong team culture that you have in this organization. And these answers can give you much more helpful information compared to an answer like, I am really dedicated and passionate about the work.
Professor, as we see more diverse generations entering the workforce, such as Gen Z, Alpha, so how do you think their value around work and motivation might challenge or reshape existing corporate cultures?
One of the biggest differences between that a Generation Z employees display compared to other employees in other generations is that they value work-life balance, leisure, mental health more. And some older employees get really annoyed by this, but I wouldn't say there is nothing wrong about you value yourself, right? It's good for our younger generation. So these employees, because they value their personal life and their like a personal mental health more, they might not like the idea of the moralization of intrinsic motivation, where you should be really passionate about your work and you have to devote yourself into your work because it can lead to potential exploitation, and we know that it does. So the moralization of intrinsic motivation doesn't really resonate this workforce, and managers might want to recognize this point and develop some policies that could address what these employees value in this new generation. And that could lead to more inclusive workforce and more a workforce where employees in different generations can communicate better with each other.
Professor, one personal question. Could you share your research journey and what motivated you to do the research?
That's a really an interesting question, and I really love this question. So it goes back to the time when I first started my PhD. I came as a more sociology-oriented PhD student in the management area, and I was writing a term paper, and the term paper was about this topic. And the reason that I got interested in this topic was whenever I went to a research seminar, there is an external speaker, and the speaker will start any presentation with the notion that this is the research question I am really interested about, or this is the research that I really love and like I feel passionate about. And I seldom observe this in my home country. So I thought there is something really special about intrinsic motivation here. And when I was teaching some undergraduate students in my PhD era, I also noticed that many of my students were agonizing about whether to choose a job they love or whether they should choose a job that pays well. And I thought this is very interesting, and that became my term paper. My advisor thought that was a really interesting idea. You should pursue this idea as your dissertation. So I was, okay, I'm going to do it. And ironically, I fell in love with the idea that we shouldn't value like loving your job. So that's some irony there, but that's how I got into this research topic.
Very insightful. Thank you. Professor, my last question. What are some key uh, takeaways you hope listeners will have after understanding the complexities of moralizing intrinsic motivation and its impact on both employees and organizations?
Yes, first thing I would like to say, of course, is intrinsic motivation is good. When you have it, it's good for you. There are multiple things you can do to increase intrinsic motivation at your work that you can try. But when you moralize intrinsic motivation and attach like moral values to it, it could lead to judgmental attitudes or potentially exploitation on yourself. So I would say acknowledging diversity in terms of motivation is the key. Most of us have multiple types of motivation at the same time. And by acknowledging this in us and in other people, we would be able to create a much more inclusive workplace for everybody. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this.
Listeners, as we wrap up today's episode, we would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Professor Mijeong Kwon for joining us and sharing her invaluable insights from her research, moral burdens at work, the dilemma of doing what you love. It's clear from our conversation that while intrinsic motivation and the idea of loving one's work are often celebrated, they also come with a complex implications for employee self-worth and interactions in the workplace. Professor Non's research sheds light on how the moralization of intrinsic motivation can influence behaviors and perceptions, leading to unintended consequences for individuals and organizations alike. Professor Mijan, thank you once again for sharing your time and knowledge with us. We look forward to following your future work and the continued impact of your research on business practices and educations.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be part of this wonderful podcast.
Thank you.